In the vast and complex tapestry of human existence, the shadow of crime has been an inescapable constant, a dark counterpart of civilization itself. Since the dawn of organized societies, the figure of the guardian of order has emerged as a bulwark against anarchy, a protector of the fragile peace that humanity yearns for. Nowadays, on the threshold of an era defined by hyperconnectivity and unprecedented scientific advancement, the work of a police officer, of a criminal investigator, remains as intrinsically dangerous and challenging as it was in the most remote times. The nature of evil, chameleon-like and persistent, mutates in its manifestations, but its essence remains unaltered, weaving intrigues and leaving, in its wake, a trail of pain and unease that demands a response. The resolution of a crime, that relentless search for the truth hidden behind the veil of deception and violence, persists as a formidable task. However, the scales of justice have been, in recent times, tilted by the weight of technological and methodological innovations that would have seemed like science fiction to previous generations. Currently, the arsenal of tools available to law enforcement is vast and deeply sophisticated. Genetic databases, for example, have revolutionized the way crimes are approached. A simple fragment of DNA, a microscopic strand of hair, an epithelial cell barely visible to the naked eye, can be cross-referenced with millions of profiles stored in gigantic digital archives. This process, which previously required weeks or months of intensive laboratory work, can now yield results with astonishing speed, connecting dots that were previously unreachable. Similarly, dactyloscopy, the study of fingerprints, has transcended its rudimentary stage to become a forensic science of millimeter precision. A unique pattern, etched on a fingertip, can now be scanned, digitized, and compared in a matter of seconds with vast collections of impressions, unveiling identities that would otherwise remain hidden in anonymity. But the evolution does not stop there. Contemporary technological investigation tools are exponentially more powerful and versatile. Consider luminol, a chemical substance that, when sprayed on a crime scene, reveals, with a phantasmagorical luminescence, the presence of blood, even that which has been vehemently washed or cleaned, transforming darkness into a silent visual confession. This bluish and spectral glow, visible only in dim light, can trace the path of an aggressor or the trajectory of a victim with chilling clarity. Beyond blood, modern forensic science allows for the exhaustive tracking and analysis of every element found at a crime scene. Textile fibers, glass fragments, paint particles, gunpowder residue, and even the tiniest hair or a nail flake. Each of these microclues becomes a vital piece of an intricate puzzle, a silent but eloquent testimony that narrates events with relentless objectivity. The ability to discern and classify these elements, to extract crucial information from them, and to connect them to a suspect or a victim, has catapulted the effectiveness of criminal investigation to unprecedented levels. However, let's go back in time, to an era not so distant, where this vast technological arsenal was, at best, a futuristic dream, or, in most cases, simply unimaginable. People dedicated to unraveling the mysteries of crime were forced to operate with a considerably more rudimentary and, often, desperately limited set of elements. Fingerprint identification, a technique already known in the early decades of the 20th century, offered the promise of irrefutable identification. If a clear fingerprint of the criminal could be obtained at the scene, there was incontrovertible proof of their presence. But the true Gordian knot lay in the ability to locate that criminal and, even more so, to be able to compare those unique fingerprints with an existing database. In the absence of a centralized and accessible system of fingerprint files, such a comparison was a chimera. Often, the only way to compare was to already have a suspect in custody, an act that presupposed a level of information rarely available at the beginning of an investigation. Back then, the police, lacking most of these sophisticated support elements, relied heavily on two fundamental pillars: human testimony and overflowing ingenuity. Eyewitnesses, with all the biases and fallibilities inherent in human memory and perception, were often the only source of direct information. Their accounts, sometimes contradictory, fragmented, or tinged by fear, shock, or even imagination, had to be scrutinized, triangulated, and validated with almost detective-like perspicacity. And, of course, there was the brain, the ingenuity, the pure deductive capacity, the trained intuition, the art of meticulous observation, and the logical reasoning that allowed these pioneers of crime to weave coherent narratives from the finest and most dispersed threads. It was a duel of minds, a battle against time and criminal cunning, fought on a playing field where technology was just beginning to stammer its first promises. Allow me now to mentally transport you to a scenario that perfectly encapsulates these challenges and the extraordinary tenacity of those who dared to face them. Mexico City, in its vibrant and tumultuous 20s and 30s of the last century. Mexico City, in the period between the 1920 seconds and 1930 seconds, was a crucible of contradictions, a metropolis in effervescence, scarred by the cataclysm of the revolution and, at the same time, full of frantic vitality. Painfully emerging from the rubble of a bloody civil war, Mexican society strove to rebuild a country that had been torn apart by a decade of armed conflicts. The echoes of gunshots still resonated in the collective memory, and the wounds, both physical and emotional, were far from healing. This post-war period did not bring with it an era of instant peace and prosperity. On the contrary, it unleashed a series of new challenges that manifested brutally in the streets and alleys of the capital. Poverty, a persistent scourge in any post-conflict society, reached epidemic levels. Famine, although mitigated in urban centers, remained a latent threat to vast sectors of the population. Job opportunities were scarce, and massive unemployment pushed countless individuals to the brink of despair. In this environment of extreme need, a considerable portion of the population was forced to live al salto de mata, a colloquial expression that described those who, by force of circumstances, were always ready to assault, to steal, to snatch what was necessary for subsistence, or simply to succumb to the temptation of crime as a way out. Economic hardships were not the only catalysts of disorder. A crucial and often underestimated factor was the ubiquitous presence of thousands of ex-combatants, men and women who had spent years immersed in the brutality of combat, who had witnessed and perpetrated unimaginable acts of violence, suddenly found themselves demobilized, without a clear purpose, without training for civilian life, and, in many cases, with their minds and spirits irrevocably marked by war. For many of them, the only skill they had perfected was that of pulling a trigger, of wielding a weapon and using it with lethality. These veterans, often traumatized and disoriented, represented a breeding ground for criminality, whether as victims or as perpetrators. The lack of adequate social reintegration structures for these heroes and villains of the revolution meant that their wartime skills too often transmuted into criminal skills. In this turbulent scenario, the Mexico City police faced an enormous workload and constant pressure. Public safety was a chimera that was earnestly sought. At that time, various police institutions operated in the capital, each with its own jurisdictions and methods, often overlapping in their efforts. The Secret Service, for example, was an elite force, known for its toughness and effectiveness in pursuing dangerous criminals. Its agents were men of action, direct and, at times, brutal, whose modus operandi did not involve subtleties. In parallel, the judicial police handled the most complex investigations, delving into the labyrinth of major crimes. Within these structures, groups of dedicated investigators emerged, men and women whose tenacity and cunning distinguished them. These detectives, in an era where media had a growing impact, often forged a legendary reputation. If one delves into the newspaper archives of those years, scrutinizing the yellowed pages of the newspapers of the time, one will frequently find mentions of the anonymous detective or the man who had entered the scene. And, against all odds, had figured out and solved the crime. Their exploits became journalistic accounts that captured the public's imagination, offering a dose of hope in a chaotic world. And it's no wonder, as many of these crimes were extraordinarily complicated, genuine unsolved riddles, where clues were scarce, witnesses non-existent or unreliable, and forensic evidence, as we have already said, almost nil. Nevertheless, they were solved. They were solved thanks to the perspicacity and mettle of exceptional men. One of these men, a figure who shone brightly in the constellation of detectives of the era, was Valente Quintana. He was, in the popular conception of the time, a great guy, a singular character. One should not imagine him as the archetype of the formidable investigator, of imposing build, with a dark and penetrating gaze, who intimidates with his mere presence. Nothing could be further from the truth. Quintana was, rather, a man of modest stature, of light build, almost ethereal in his appearance, who moved with a discretion that made him go unnoticed. His strength did not reside in muscle or intimidation, but in the sharp tool of his intellect. Valente Quintana was known, and rightly so, as the Mexican Sherlock Holmes. This appellation was not a simple, superficial analogy, but a recognition of his extraordinary capacity for observation, his sharp ingenuity, that analytical mind that could unravel the most subtle threads of evidence. He was not a violent type. His modus operandi did not involve brute force or direct confrontation. For those tasks there were the Secret Service agents, the tough guys, the men who imposed order with authority and, if necessary, with physical force. Quintana, on the contrary, was the observer par excellence, the meticulous analyst who examined crime scenes with almost monastic patience, and more importantly, with a truly unusual logic, devoid of prejudices and preconceptions. His mind was a laboratory of deductions, where every detail, however insignificant it might seem, was weighed and fitted into a broader pattern. If this description seems unbelievable to you, if you doubt the extraordinary perspicacity of this man, allow me then, kind listener, to transport you even further back in time. We are going to embark on an imaginary journey, a quantum leap in history to place ourselves in the heart of that bustling and mysterious Mexico City. Our first stop will take us to a street that, at first glance, might seem just another artery in the urban labyrinth, but which holds in its cobblestones and facades a story that defies logic and attests to the genius of Valente Quintana. We refer to Matamoros Street, located in the popular and vibrant Peralvillo neighborhood, a district that, in those years, was a microcosm of capital life, with its markets, its pulquerias, and its houses that kept silent secrets. Let's imagine the scene. Matamoros Street, a network of concrete and asphalt that winds through Colonia Peralvillo, in the heart of Mexico City. Nowadays, if one ventures to walk along it, near the confluence with Artesano Street, one will find a series of constructions that bear witness to the relentless passage of time. Some are old structures, with facades worn by decades of sun and rain, their doors and windows laden with silent stories. Others are buildings in a state of perpetual unfinished construction, skeletons of concrete and rebar that promise a future that seems never to arrive, or that simply evoke a sense of incompleteness of a project halted in time. It is not precisely a place that invites euphoria or exclamations of joy. It is, rather, a corner of the city where life unfolds at its leisurely pace, amidst the coming and going of vehicles and pedestrians. However, beneath that anodyne appearance lies the memory of a drama that shook the capital. Many years ago, before the skeleton of that building under construction rose defiantly towards the sky, a different house stood in its place, a two-story residence that, even then, already boasted the venerable appearance of antiquity. It was the house marked with the number 37 on Matamoros Street, and on its walls was etched a story that would make it infamous and that would inextricably intertwine with the name of Valente Quintana, the celebrated Mexican Sherlock Holmes. The events that granted it this notoriety began on a fateful day, the 18th of April, 1929. On that date, the routine of a man named Tomas Mejia was interrupted by a growing unease. Tomas was a tinajero, an artisan dedicated to the preparation of pulque, that ancestral and enigmatic Mexican alcoholic beverage. The tinajero was the custodian of an alchemical process, fermenting the aguamiel extracted from the maguey, skillfully mixing it and curing it with fruits or honey to create a thick and intoxicating drink. Was the popular drink par excellence, the nectar of the gods for those who could not afford more expensive liquors, and a much appreciated pleasure even by those who could. It was a strong drink, with a rustic and deep character, rooted in Mexican culture and traditions. Tomas Mejia worked for a prosperous pulque entrepreneur, a businessman whose empire was built on the foundation of this ancient beverage. His boss was Tito Basurto, an individual of strong character and considerable fortune. Tito Basurto owned several pulquerias strategically distributed throughout Mexico City, as well as tinacales, the places where pulque was prepared and stored, and, more importantly, vast properties where maguey plants were cultivated and the precious aguamiel, the sweet sap that would give rise to pulque, was extracted. He had haciendas that were true production centers, and he lived precisely in that two-story house, number 37, on Matamoros Street in Parrot. There he shared his life with his wife, Jobita, a kind-hearted woman, with a trusted domestic employee named Luz Laguna, and with a girl of just 10 years old, Maria de Jesus Miranda. The little girl had come from one of the towns where Tito had his pulque haciendas, a common practice at the time. When rural families could not afford their children's education, they sent them to work in good houses in the city, where they would at least have food and a roof. And the Basurto's house was, without a doubt, a good house. Don Tito was energetic in his business, but respectful at home, and Doña Jobita radiated kindness. The Basurto's routine was methodical and predictable. Every morning, at first light, Tito would go out to inspect his pulquerias and his properties, ensuring the smooth operation of his empire. He would return home for lunch, a moment of calm amidst his busy day, and then go out again to supervise the day's sales, review accounts, and make sure everything was in order. He was an extraordinarily busy man, but also a man of unbreakable habits. That's why, when Tomas Mejia, the tinajero, waited in vain for his boss on the 17th and, again, on the 18th of April 1929, a strange pang of unease began to assail him. It was not like Don Tito to miss his appointments. Something was wrong. With some accounts and pending matters in hand, Tomas decided to go look for him at his home. Upon arriving at the old house on Matamoros Street, he knocked on the door with a closed fist, expecting Don Tito's energetic voice or Doña Jobita's affable presence. There was no answer. He knocked again, more insistently, but the sepulchral silence of the house was the only reply. A shiver began to run down Tomas's spine. He settled on a stone on the sidewalk, a place from which he could glimpse through a window the interior of the office where Tito usually worked. What he saw petrified him. Behind the desk, barely visible, his boss's feet protruded. Everything was in absolute silence, a silence that screamed that something terrible had happened. He tried to open the door again, but it was locked tight. At that moment, as if fate were weaving a web of coincidences, several neighboring ladies approached. They too, with the perspicacity of those who observe the life of their street day after day, had noticed the unusual quietness in the Basurto's house. It was inexplicable. Don Tito, with almost military punctuality, religiously left at 6 in the morning. Doña Jobita, or her employee, Luz Laguna, always went for fresh bread in the morning, and at noon, without fail, for tortillas for lunch. But neither the day before nor that day had they seen any movement. The strangest thing was that Doña Jobita, an open and communicative woman, had not mentioned to anyone if they planned to be absent, perhaps at one of their haciendas. Their sudden invisibility was an anomaly. The gossiping women, with whispers and glances laden with worry, began to exchange impressions. Unease transformed into fear, and fear into the need to act. Finally, one of them made the decision. It was necessary to call the police. The year was 1929, and April 18 was consolidating as a black date. Tomas Mejia, the tinajero, was the one who found a police officer and communicated the strange situation to him. The officer, in turn, following the protocol of the time, informed a superior. In a time when telephones were not abundant and communications moved with the slowness of bureaucratic procedures, the news spread by word of mouth. Matamoros Street began to fill with curious neighbors, nervous murmurs, and the growing presence of authority. Finally, a police chief, a man of experience, arrived at the scene. He peered through the window and, indeed, confirmed the macabre vision of Tito Basurto's inert feet. The main door, solid and without signs of violence, resisted being opened. An act of audacity was necessary. A police officer, taking advantage of a neighboring house, jumped from the outside. Once inside the property's perimeter, with surprising agility, he removed his pistol and vest to facilitate movement, forced the entry from the inside, and opened the main door. What they found upon entering plunged everyone into a silence of horror. Immediately to the right of the entrance, in what was Tito Basurto's office, the lifeless body of the wealthy pulque producer lay on the floor. He had been murdered, and in the most savage way imaginable. The scene was brutal, a silent testimony to the violence that had erupted in that home. Given the magnitude of the discovery, the police chief, with a firm voice, ordered that no one touch anything. The crime scene had to be preserved in its original state. The curious and less experienced agents were removed. "Bring the detective," the officer decreed, knowing that this case would require the sharpest mind available. And that's how Valente Quintana arrived. His presence, far from being imposing, went almost unnoticed. Small in stature, with an innate discretion, Quintana moved through the house with a calm that contrasted with the chaos of the situation. His eyes, however, were two radars that absorbed every detail, every shadow, every imperfection. He observed Tito Basurto's body. It was evident. He had been murdered with excessive viciousness. The blows he had received were brutal, a fierce aggression that revealed unheard of rage. Then, the final thrust, the bladed weapon that had sealed his fate. The detective advanced through the house, guided by his intuition and the logic of the tragedy. They reached an inner courtyard, a space that, under normal circumstances, would be a haven of peace. There, the sight became even more desolate. The body of Luz Laguna, the domestic employee, a woman of about 65, whose loyalty and trust for the Basurto family were unquestionable, lay there. The condition of her body was terrible, a reflection of the extreme violence with which her life had been taken. And next to her, inert, little Maria de Jesus Miranda, the 10-year-old girl, had also been murdered. It was a horrendous spectacle, a triple tragedy that chilled the blood. "No one touch anything," Quintana repeated, in a voice barely audible but full of authority. Accompanied by another detective and a public prosecutor's agent, he began the ascent up the staircase leading to the second level of the house. Upstairs, in one of the rooms, the horror continued. They found the lifeless body of Doña Jovita, Tito's wife. The modus operandi was the same: multiple blows, followed by stabbings. It was a systematic massacre, an act of barbarity that had annihilated an entire family. The scene in Doña Jovita's room revealed more clues. There were jewels scattered on the floor, open jewelry boxes, and a large disordered wardrobe with its contents rummaged through. In another room, the absence of objects was also noticeable. It was obvious that the motive was robbery. Someone had entered with the intention of stealing valuable objects. But here lay the first anomaly that caught Valente Quintana's attention. The main door had not been forced, nor did it show signs of having been violated. It was locked from the inside. This could only mean one thing. The person who had entered had done so through the door, and someone, from the inside, had opened it for them. It was a very strange detail that broke with the logic of a simple burglary. But the inconsistencies did not end there. Valente, with his keen gaze, could observe that, although some jewels and valuable objects had been taken, other belongings of considerably greater value had remained untouched, ignored by the attackers. This suggested that the motive of robbery, although present, was perhaps not the only or main one. The viciousness of the attack, the brutality with which 4 people had been killed, was also a highly notorious factor. It was not the typical crime of a thief trying to minimize risk. Here, there was unbridled fury. Quintana deduced that Tito Basurto had been the first victim, falling in his office, in the same place where he was found. The body had not been moved, which simplified the sequence of events. Then, the footprints found on the floor revealed the attacker's path towards the area where Luz Laguna and the girl Maria de Jesus were. The footprints clearly indicated movement in that direction, with no traces of return. The last to be murdered had been Mrs. Jobita, on the 2nd floor. The sequence of the tragedy began to unfold with chilling clarity. The main enigma now was, who had committed such an atrocity? At the scene, yes, they found the murder weapon, a large knife, still covered in the victim's blood. And on it, with a clarity that defied chaos, fingerprints were distinguishable. By 1929, the technique of fingerprint identification was already known and applied with some effectiveness. The identification of the prints itself was not the problem. The real obstacle, as had already been pointed out, lay in the absence of a centralized database. Even if the criminal's fingerprints were available, there was no record that would allow them to be quickly compared and an identity obtained. If there was no suspect in mind with whom to cross-reference those impressions, the task of finding the culprit became a search in immensity. But Valente Quintana, that detective with a penetrating gaze and incisive thought, was not deterred by the lack of infrastructure. His intuition, forged in years of experience and a superior capacity for observation, dictated a disturbing truth to him. The killer must be someone known to the family, someone close, someone whose presence in the home would not arouse suspicion and to whom the door would have been opened without misgiving. How could he know this with such certainty? There was a detail, macabre and subtle, that only a detective as meticulous as Quintana could have noticed amidst the barbarity. In the upper part of the house, near where Doña Jobita's corpse lay, agents found one more body, that of the family's parrot. The Basurtos had a parrot, a large parakeet with vibrant plumage and a prodigiously black tongue. One of those specimens that, with their acute intelligence, are capable of imitating human speech with astonishing clarity. It was a talkative bird, known in the neighborhood for its habit of repeating phrases and, sometimes, the swear words it heard from Tito or anyone else. Chatty and noisy, it was a constant presence in the home. Now, it lay inert, wrapped in a towel, its vibrant plumage dulled by death. When forensic experts examined it, there was no doubt it had been murdered. The question resonated in Quintana's mind. Why? Why would someone bother to kill a parrot in the midst of such a brutal massacre? The answer, for Valente Quintana, was a flash of lucidity. They killed it so it wouldn't betray the killer. This macabre conclusion implied an even more chilling truth. The attacker was, without a doubt, known to the victims. Most likely, in the heat of the aggression, one of the victims, perhaps Doña Jobita in her desperation, would have uttered the aggressor's name. The parakeet, with its infallible memory and tendency to repetition, would have absorbed those words, becoming a silent but eloquent witness. Realizing that the bird could be an informant, the killer, in an act of panic, would have silenced it forever. It is very probable that Mrs. Jobita, or one of the members of that family, would have repeated the attacker's name. Quintana murmured, "We must investigate the family. That is where we will find the culprit." With this bold hypothesis, Valente Quintana and his team delved into the intricate network of Tito Basurto's family relationships. The family was a microcosm of affections and grudges, of hidden debts and resentments. Don Tito, despite his prosperity, was not universally liked. His rough character and inflexible way of conducting business had earned him some enmities, even among his own relatives. He had several scores to settle, as was said at the time, referring to unpaid debts or family disputes. Some of his relatives definitely had no affection for him. Among the possible suspects, the name of Arnolfo emerged, a nephew to whom Tito had lent money to buy a car and work with him, a kind of family investment so the young man could earn a living. However, the relationship had deteriorated. Arnolfo was not punctual in his payments, nor diligent in accounting. Frictions had accumulated, culminating in a heated discussion one day when Arnolfo, under the influence of alcohol, had sworn that he was going to kill Tito. It was a strong clue, but the investigation revealed crucial inconsistencies. The last time Tito Basurto had been seen alive was around 9 in the morning on April 17, when he was returning from inspecting one of his pulquerias. At that precise moment, Arnolfo was working and would not have arrived home until late at night. The timings did not match. Arnolfo's lead vanished. The search had to continue, employing old-fashioned methods. An order was issued to interrogate all close relatives, to bring them in for questioning. One by one, they paraded before the discerning eyes of Valente Quintana and his team. Each had an alibi, or simply their profile did not fit the brutality of the crime, until a new detail came to light. There was another relative, Atenogenes Carrasco, who worked in one of Tito's pulquerias. The relationship between them was a constant source of conflict. Every time Tito went to collect or check the accounts, he invariably found that money was missing. Atenogenes, it seemed, was not a thief, but his son, Luis Romero Carrasco, was. This young man, Tito's nephew, was the rotten apple of the family. Immediately, he was located, brought in, and subjected to interrogation. Luis Romero Carrasco, a young man with a disheveled appearance, did not take long to confess. The pressure from the detectives, the intensity of the questions, the burden of guilt, or perhaps a combination of everything, broke him. He ended up admitting that he had been the perpetrator of the massacre. The killer's name was finally in the hands of the authorities. Luis Romero Carrasco, the nephew, had committed an atrocious crime. His statement revealed a whirlwind of repressed emotions and sordid motivations. Luis harbored a deep resentment towards his uncle Tito. He hated him with visceral intensity. Tito used to yell at his father, Atenogenes, with cruel and humiliating words, reproaching him for shortcomings at the pulqueria, threatening to take away his business. And although Luis promised himself that he would help his father, that he would pay the debts, Tito's threats and shouts continued, fueling a silent anger in the young man's heart. But behind this facade of family resentment, there was a darker reality. Luis was a freeloading nephew, a parasite who took advantage of the family, with a criminal record that included several stints in prison. He was addicted to marijuana, consumed large quantities of cigarettes, and to finance his vice, he did not hesitate to steal from his father's pulqueria's cash register. The breaking point came when Don Tito announced his intention to take the pulqueria from Atenogenes. For Luis, that meant the end of his source of illicit income, the cutoff of his drug supply. The prospect of being left without money and without his addiction plunged him into a state of desperation. His mind, already clouded by drugs and resentment, conceived the idea that the only solution was to kill his uncle. In his disturbed mind, only that terrible resolution fit. All afternoon and night of the 16th of April, 1929, Luis Romero Carrasco spent ruminating on his macabre plan. He had even spoken with a couple of accomplices, 2 petty thieves, whom he had convinced that this would be an exceptional score, that they would obtain a fortune. All they had to do was accompany him and keep watch. Those 2 accomplices, seduced by the promise of a great loot, accepted the pact with the devil. They agreed, and on the morning of April 17, 1929, a crucial detail, as the day of the murders was the 17th, not the 18th, as initially believed. Luis Romero Carrasco smoked 4 marijuana cigarettes in a row. He was completely intoxicated, plunged into a spiral of paranoia and aggression when he left his house. He carried a sharp knife and, hidden among his clothes, a piece of pipe, similar to a police baton, a blunt weapon that would guarantee the lethality of his attack. He walked aimlessly, looking for his uncle, his mind so altered that he didn't even remember the details of his own plan. The drug had erased any trace of coherence. Uncle Tito, in his usual routine, found him in the middle of the street. Seeing his nephew in that deplorable state, he scolded him severely. "How can you be like this, boy, in your 20s? Just look at yourself." With a gesture of compassion, despite his harshness, he pulled him and brought him into his own house, with the intention of letting the drug's effect wear off. Perhaps to give him something to eat. To try to straighten him out once more. It was an act of mercy that sealed his fate. When Tito Basurto sat down at his workbench, ready to review his accounts, Luis, consumed by drug and fury, stood behind him, dealt him a brutal blow to the head with the pipe, and then, with the knife, ended his life. Tito died in his own office, betrayed by the hand that tried to help him. At that instant, on the threshold of the house, Luz Laguna and little Maria de Jesus entered, who saw the inert body of the boss. They threatened to scream, to call for help. Luis, in a murderous frenzy, attacked them, silencing them forever. And then, as if the tragedy were not enough, he realized that his Aunt Jobata had peered from the upper floor, alerted by the noise. That fleeting gaze, full of terror, was her death sentence. He ran up the stairs, with the still smoking knife in his hand, to kill her too. Meanwhile, the 2 accomplices, who had entered the house, began to rummage here and there, visibly nervous. They did not expect a massacre of such magnitude. They thought the house would be empty, that it would be a simple robbery. But when hell broke loose, panic invaded them. Luis, consummating his fury, finished off his aunt, Jobita. After the carnage, the 3 men, in a state of confusion and terror, gathered some belongings, valuable objects they managed to hastily take, and fled the house. Luis, so drugged and altered, didn't even know where he was going. His escape was a whirlwind without direction. When he finally confessed all this, Valente Quintana had already unraveled much of the enigma. However, one piece remained to fit into the puzzle. Why did you kill the parakeet? Luis, with a macabre gesture, laughed, refusing to answer. But the accomplices, under the weight of the interrogation, revealed the missing detail. When Luis had murdered his aunt, Jobita, the parakeet, with its strident voice, had begun to scream non-stop, "Luis, Luis, Luis!" And not only that, but, in its peculiar repertoire, the bird uttered a lot of swear words. Perhaps words it had heard Tito say in his discussions with his nephew. Luis, realizing that the parakeet would betray him, quickly wrapped it in a cloth and suffocated it, silencing the only talking witness. The authorities had the case solved. The month of April 1929 had not even ended, and Valente Quintana had unraveled the complex plot of this horrendous crime. The Mexican Sherlock Holmes was the hero of Mexico City. His deductions, his keen intuition, had been confirmed by the killer's confession. The fingerprints found on the knife could, finally, be cross-referenced with those of Luis Romero Carrasco, sealing his guilt. The other 2 accomplices, while participating in the robbery, were not the direct murderers. The trial took place, and Luis was sentenced to death. However, in Mexico, the application of capital punishment was not common at that time, and his sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. He was sent to the infamous Belén prison. But Luis was a dangerous type, a seasoned criminal who had already been to prison on several occasions. He knew the tricks of the system. He soon managed to escape from Belén, evading surveillance and sowing terror anew. However, his freedom was ephemeral. The authorities quickly recaptured him. This time, he was confined in Leckembury prison, the imposing black prison, from where, it was said, no one escapes. Despite his incarceration, popular outcry, outraged by the brutality of his crimes and his evasion, demanded a more forceful justice. "Hang him," was heard in the streets. The human beast, as the press dubbed him, had become a symbol of evil that had to be eradicated. It was decided to transfer him to a very remote and horrible prison in the Islas Marias, a penal archipelago in the Pacific, a place of torment and oblivion, where inmates faced inhuman conditions. But Luis Romero Carrasco never reached his destination. According to official police reports, halfway there, Luis tried to escape from his custodians, assaulted a police officer, and began a desperate run. There was no other option but to shoot him. Of course, no one believed that version. In Mexico, there was a sinister practice known as the Ley Fuga, escape law. It was a form of extrajudicial execution, a brutal euphemism. The inmate they wanted to finish off, whom they wanted to exterminate, was told, with a cynical gesture, "Start running. And if you manage to cross over there, you've escaped." But the reality was different. The prisoner was expected to advance a few steps, and then 3 shots ended his life. Such was the case of Luis Romero Carrasco. The Ley Fuga was applied to the human beast. The press of the time boasted of the news, immortalizing the criminal's nickname. And here lies the final paradox of this story. If Luis Romero Carrasco had not killed the parakeet, perhaps he would never have been discovered. The bird, an unexpected, silently observing witness, became the crucial element. Even after its death, the parakeet ended the story of this criminal. Valente Quintana was, without a doubt, a bold detective, but it is undeniable that this story is strange, almost implausible. A simple parakeet, even after death, closed the circle of a brutal crime. Sometimes, witnesses can be very rare. Sometimes, they are parakeets. And if this story is not enough to convince you of the existence of unusual witnesses, allow me to change location. From bustling Mexico City, we will move to the northeast of the country, to the prosperous city of Monterrey. If you visit Monterrey today, a metropolis of steel and opportunities, you will notice in its center a common street, full of life and movement, Aramberry Street. Countless cars travel along it, coming and going, carrying the pulse of the city. But approximately halfway along its route, on the right side, stands a house that interrupts the urban monotony, an old construction with a somber and desolate appearance. From the outside, its condition is lamentable. Inside, it is even worse. Part of the roofs have collapsed, opening holes to the sky, and its walls are covered in paint, in graffiti that narrates clandestine and ephemeral stories. But the physical deterioration is only part of its tragic reality. Inside, dark rituals, esoteric practices, and acts of witchcraft have been carried out, leaving a gloomy imprint. Some have gone ghost hunting, seeking the echo of invisible presences, others, simply, to consume drugs in the dim light. It is, in essence, a dangerous place, a refuge for the illicit and the paranormal. The authorities, aware of its deterioration and the risks it entailed, had to completely wall up its accesses, turning it into a mausoleum of cement and oblivion. Only until recently, the building remained abandoned, a ghost in the heart of the city. Recently, a project for its restoration and reuse has been initiated, although its final purpose is still uncertain. Until the 80s of the last century, it still housed some activity, a modest office, it is said, of a dentist. But this house has a tremendous story, one that, like that of Matamoros, is directly related to unusual witnesses. This house, the one on Aramberry Street, hides the story of another crime, a drama that unfolded in 1933. In that year, It was the home of Delfino Montemayor's family, a hard-working man and his wife, Antonia Lozano, along with their daughter, Florinda Montemayor. They had arrived in Monterrey from Suazua, a community in Nuevo León, seeking the opportunities offered by the big, beautiful, and bustling city. They had sold their properties and their house in Suazua, investing their hopes in the metropolis. Delfino, moreover, had found work in a nearby foundry, a stable job that provided him with good income. He was a man with some money, and having sold his rural properties, he had received payment in gold pesos, a heavy currency with an intrinsic value that made it immune to the fluctuations of paper bills. It was 4,000 gold pesos, a considerable sum for the time, a fortune that promised a better life. Don Delfino and his family had settled well in Monterrey. They had forged good friendships, and other relatives of theirs lived in the same area, which facilitated their integration. Life unfolded with the placidity that work and stability provide. But the harmony broke on the 5th of April 1933. Don Delfino left home, as was his custom, at 6 in the morning. He was a man of rigorous habits, punctual to the extreme. Hat, coat, his lunchbox with lunch, and on foot, he headed to his work at the foundry. Normally, he would leave at that hour and return shortly after 6 in the evening. That day passed with apparent normality. No one noticed anything strange on the street. The world continued to move in its incessant coming and going. It is important to remember that Arumberry was a central street, and at that time, public transport was limited and automobiles were a rarity. People walked a lot, and they did so on the sidewalks, which implied that countless people passed in front of the Montemayor's house throughout the day without realizing the tragedy that was brewing inside. Finally, Don Delfino returned home between 6 and 6:30 in the evening. He opened the door, and, as was his custom, he called out his wife's or daughter's name, expecting a welcome, for them to help him with his lunchbox and invite him to sit down quietly. But there was no answer. A chilling and unusual silence greeted him. He advanced a few steps, and what he saw plunged him into unspeakable horror. His wife, Doña Antonia, and his daughter, Florinda, lay dead on the floor. It was a dreadful spectacle, a scene of brutal violence that dismembered his existence. He staggered towards the door and began to scream for help, his voice torn by pain and desperation. Very soon, the clamor of his lamentations attracted the neighbors, and in a matter of moments, a crowd of people gathered in the street, peering with morbid curiosity and terror. The police did not take long to arrive. With the urgency that the situation demanded, they moved the crowd away, cordoned off the area, and allowed the detectives to enter, who began the arduous task of investigating. Detective Inés González was the man in charge of taking on the investigation. González was an old-school policeman, one of those who would give you a blow to the head if you misbehaved. His presence was imposing, a grim look, a tilted hat, a filterless cigarette permanently hanging from his lips, and that strange gaze that seemed to read the soul. When he asked, "Was it you?" He was a big man, of robust build, and curiously, fair-skinned, half-blonde. Something not so common in the region. Inés González entered the house and, with the keenness that characterized him, began to observe. He checked every corner, every detail. The attack had been brutal, merciless. Young Florinda, it seemed, had been attacked in a particularly cruel way, beyond mere homicide. The detective returned to the main area of the house. He found drawers scattered, rummaged through, and on the floor, a coin. When he asked Don Delfino what that coin was, the widower, in a choked voice, informed him about the money, the gold pesos he kept at home. It was a robbery. Something had gone terribly wrong, and in the process, his wife and daughter had been murdered. A terrible picture, an emptiness that life could never fill. González continued his meticulous review, but found no crucial elements, such as the murder weapon. He turned around, examined the main door. The house was, apparently, very secure, with thick bars on the windows and a solid wooden gate built to resist. But there were no signs that it had been forced, and from the roof it was practically impossible for anyone to have jumped to enter. Furthermore, the neighbors on both sides of the house, immediately interrogated, declared not having seen or heard anything strange throughout the day. Then, the logical deduction imposed itself. They entered through the door. This, as in Tito Basurto's case, pointed to a family member. Relatives had to be relatives, Gonzalez decreed. The investigation focused on the family's inner circle. Inés Gonzalez, a man who did not beat around the bush, applied his expeditious methods, and, as expected, he soon discovered the truth. The killers were 4 individuals: Gabriel Villarreal and Emeterio Gonzalez, who owned a butcher shop in the neighborhood, and Eliodoro Montemayor and Fernando Montemayor, direct nephews of Don Delfino. There was the secret: they had been discovered. Quickly, they were captured, subjected to an incisive interrogation, and admitted their guilt. The nephews confessed that they had heard their uncle Delfino talk about the money, about the gold pesos he had received from the sale of his properties. And since he didn't use the bank, they assumed he kept it at home. This rumor spread among them, and they shared it with the butchers, who thought it was a good idea to go and rob. To make matters worse, Mrs. Florinda, the murdered daughter, was Gabriel Villarreal's aunt. It was a family business, a betrayal in its rawest sense. They planned the assault knowing that Don Delfino left at 6 in the morning and would not return until the afternoon. They decided to go to the house, knock on the door under any pretext, and once the aunt opened, force their way in, steal everything, and, chillingly, they were willing to kill. It was that simple. Case solved. They had confessed. There was another accomplice involved, but he had not directly participated in the murders. He was also apprehended. The entire community was outraged. At that moment, no one could imagine a robbery of such magnitude and with such cruelty, especially when it involved relatives. Don Delfino was not an evil man. On the contrary, he was known for his generosity, for having helped many of his relatives without limits. He was a man of the hat, a true Reggio, person from Monterrey, one of those who appreciate machaca, dried meat, and good meat, but who were also upright and correct. His kindness was met with the vilest betrayal. The trial came, the culprits were prosecuted and sentenced, but they did not serve their sentence. And here, again, the dark shadow of the Ley Fuga loomed over justice. When the public ministry agents and 3 police officers were preparing to carry out the reconstruction of events of the distribution of the loot, the money, and stolen objects that had been recovered, the official story differs from the unofficial one. There was no such reconstruction. They took them to the vicinity of a cemetery, took them out of the van or patrol car in which they were transporting them, and shouted the infamous phrase, "Run, kids. Whoever reaches that place is free, and whoever doesn't, dies here." Officially, it was declared that they had tried to escape, and therefore they had been shot. The Ley Fuga, today known as extrajudicial execution, is a delicate and dark practice, far from being a joking matter. It is the consummation of brutal and extra-legal justice. That woman, Doña Antonia, had opened the door to her own nephews, without suspecting the death that awaited her. And young Florinda, barely 19 years old, had her life taken in the saddest way. Why am I telling you this? The authorities, in their official report, declared having solved the case based on several conclusive pieces of evidence. First, the door had not been violated, which led them to the inescapable conclusion that the killer was someone known, a family member. Second, and this is where the story takes an unusual turn, they claimed to have found the trail of blood on the sidewalk, droplets that led them directly to the butcher shop of those involved. It sounded good. It had logic, a perfectly plausible sequence of events. But, unofficially, another version circulated, one that was whispered in corners, and that, for many, was the true one. It was said that the case had been solved thanks to an unexpected witness. Mrs. Florinda had a parakeet, a large parrot, one of those that imitate human speech with surprising fidelity. When the police entered the house, the parakeet, in its cage, began to scream incessantly. "Don't kill me, Gabriel. Don't kill me, Gabriel." Exactly the same thing that had happened to the parakeet in the case of the human beast in Mexico City. Of course, the police never officially admitted that this version was true. The vast majority of internet pages and current records categorize it as an urban legend. However, at the time, newspapers of the era, with their sensationalist headlines, did mention that witnesses heard that the parakeet was screaming, "Don't kill me, Gabriel, don't kill me, Gabriel." For some analysts, this urban legend is not so much one, and it is not because the official version, that of the blood droplets, is, at least, difficult to believe. Let's think. Don Delfino leaves at 6 in the morning and returns after 6 in the evening. 12 hours. 12 hours on an extremely busy street in downtown Monterrey. But there's more. The killer's butcher shop was very, very far, about 20 blocks from the Montemayor's house. Is it conceivable that a killer, with a bloody knife, would be happy-go-lucky, leaving a trail of blood on the sidewalk for kilometers, without worrying about being seen or discovered? It is hardly credible. The blood would have dried, would have been diluted with dust and dirt, and would have been trampled by hundreds of people during that 12-hour period. Isn't it more plausible that a parakeet, at the moment of the attack, would have started screaming, "Don't kill me, Gabriel," and that a witness, perhaps one of the first police officers or neighbors to arrive, would have heard it? One of the police officers, in fact, unofficially assured that he was the one who heard the parakeet and informed Detective Inés González, who, consequently, would have followed that lead. The parakeet was a witness. The problem, of course, is how to record such a testimony in an official investigation. Thus, the parakeet story remained in the realm of legend, a story that adds a veil of mystery to the Arambury house. And it is not the only legend surrounding this house. Behind the myth of the parakeet, other horrifying stories are woven, tales of ghosts and spectral presences that have kept the place unoccupied for years. The reality is that Don Delfino, after the tragedy, lived in the house for only a couple more years before moving to another residence, never wanting to reveal the true reason for his departure. The house was used for different purposes, but its occupants always left precipitously. Many claimed it was because of the screams heard at night, because of the strange sounds, the unexplained movements, and the shadows that danced in the dim light. This halo of mystery and horror caused that, when it became empty, the house was invaded by curious people, by holy men, by witches who have performed everything from cleansing rituals to satanic rituals there, turning it into an epicenter of the occult. A few years ago, the state government considered demolishing the house, but at the last minute, the initiative was halted. It is a property that possesses a history, a value that transcended its state of abandonment, and people did not allow it to be torn down. Nowadays, an attempt is being made to remodel it. Although the final purpose of its new life is still up in the air, it is a place where an intricate story has been woven, where a mysterious witness, a parakeet, challenges the official version. Because, honestly, following a blood trail for 20-something blocks, for 12 hours, on a busy street, trampled by hundreds of people, with a careless killer carrying a bloody knife, something simply doesn't fit into criminal logic. I don't know about you, but if that's not enough to immerse you in the world of unusual witnesses, there's another case that, to me particularly, has powerfully caught my attention, and that, surely, our Argentine friends will have heard of. It is a very sad case, dating back to 2018, in the Virias Oeste area, in the vibrant city of Buenos Aires, Argentina, at the corner of Boedo and Gorriti streets. A horrible crime was conceived. A woman named Elizabeth was murdered in the saddest and most violent way imaginable. She was outraged, subjected to unimaginable vexations, her life brutally taken. The police received a telephone report, an anonymous call alerting them to the discovery of the murdered woman. The agents mobilized with the swiftness that the situation demanded. The investigation, in this case, was not as difficult to achieve as in the previous ones. Precisely because of a crucial detail, the person who called the police was a housemate of the victim, a man everyone knew as Mambo, a subject in his 30s. In that humble house, on Boedo Street corner Goriti, lived Elizabeth, this man, Mambo, Miguel, Saturnino Rolón, known as Uncle Jorge Raúl Alvarez, in his 60s. They shared a kind of attic, an improvised room on the upper part, a very crude thing, which reflected the precariousness of their existence. Liz, as Elizabeth was known, was a person who, apparently, suffered from some intellectual deficiency or problem, which made her particularly vulnerable. She had moved in to live with them, perhaps seeking refuge, companionship in solitude. The three lived in that confined space. It was Mambo who called the police to report the discovery of the murdered girl. When the police, following protocol, asked for any additional details, that man made a grave mistake, a slip that would seal his fate. She strangled, he said, but the agents had not yet revealed any official clue about the cause of death. That information could only be possessed by the killer. Immediately, the investigation took a different turn. When police agents entered the home, they noticed something very disturbing. The girl lay sprawled, brutally attacked, and to one side, imperturbable, there was a parakeet. A live parrot, which had not been harmed, and the parrot, with its repetitive and strident voice, kept screaming, "Oh, please let me go. Oh no. Oh, please let me go. Oh no." The detectives, seasoned in 1,000 battles, soon realized several things. First, the parakeet was repeating, over and over again, the last heartbreaking phrases Elizabeth might have uttered in life. Those words, "Oh, please let me go. Oh no," vehemently suggested that the victim probably knew the person who was attacking her, that she was pleading for her life, that she recognized her aggressor. This, by itself, was not enough for a conviction, but Mambo's mistake in revealing the strangulation when the police had not disclosed that detail became a key piece. His implicit confession accelerated the investigation. Samples were taken from the suspects. The forensic expert in charge of the case, a renowned man whose expertise was legendary, the same one who, curiously, would conduct the study in the Diego Armando Maradona case years later, examined the victim's arm and discovered a human bite mark. When comparing the bite mark found on the corpse with the dentition of one of the suspects, specifically Mambo's, the match was irrefutable. It was the same. Afterwards, with the help of modern DNA forensic evidence, forensic science sealed the fate of the two men. It was fully demonstrated that both had committed the crime. In this case, the parakeet, although a moving witness, was not the main evidence. Modern forensic advances allowed for a more certain reconstruction of the true way in which the events had occurred. Those two vagrants, probably, had chosen to attack the girl. Elizabeth resisted, and in the struggle, they killed her. Again, a very sad, very painful case. But once again, there was a parakeet. And you know what? In the criminal file, in the official documents of the investigation, it is recorded that the parakeet kept repeating, "Oh, please let me go. Oh no." It was a witness, and it was included as such, an anomaly in the annals of justice, but irrefutable testimony of what the bird had witnessed. It is not always included, it is true, but in this case, the singularity of the situation warranted it. Crossing continents. In the United States, in 2015, another case occurred that challenged conventions. Martin Durham was shot 5 times in his home in Sand Lake, Michigan. Authorities arrived at the scene and found him lifeless. Next to him, his wife, Glenna, had a dreadful gunshot wound to the head, and the weapon lay nearby. The mechanics of the crime were not difficult to identify. Probably, the woman had taken the weapon, shot her husband, and then tried to commit suicide by shooting herself. The defense lawyer, in a desperate attempt, tried to argue that the woman was under the influence of drugs, that she didn't know what she was doing, that it had been a mistake, anything that could mitigate the brutality of the act. Days passed, and the parakeet that lived in the house, the family pet, which everyone knew was foul-mouthed like few things, that repeated swear words all the time, was given to Martin's ex-wife. Martin had had a previous marriage, and the relationship with his ex-wife was good. The parakeet had been a shared pet at one point. Thus, when Martin passed away, the animal ended up in the hands of its former owner. One good day, the ex-wife, visibly disturbed, called the authorities and told them, "Listen, this might interest you, but the parakeet keeps repeating, 'Don't shoot me, Glenna, daughter of who knows who,' and a lot of vulgarities. 'Don't shoot me, Glenna,' the parakeet repeated again and again, in Martin's voice. The parakeet was accusing the killer. The investigators, although surprised, began to connect the dots. Unofficially, ladies and gentlemen, because that could not be included in the official file. Nor as aggravating testimony, the current legislation of the state of Michigan does not allow animal testimonies. A theory was formed. Apparently, when Glenna, after shooting her husband, realized that the parakeet kept repeating his last words, she shot herself in a desperate attempt to silence the only witness. The parakeet's revenge. Although it was not part of the legal evidence, the parakeet's repetition provided devastating logic to the sequence of events. It is not known why she did not try to shoot the parakeet, but the fact is that the case was solved. Again, a very sad case, with an unusual witness who, despite legal limitations, shed crucial light on the truth. But there's more. If you're still not convinced, there's a 2014 case that takes this narrative even further. One good day, a family in India was preparing to attend a wedding. It was the family of Vijay Sharma, a respected newspaper editor. He, along with his daughter and son, were getting ready to go to a relative's celebration. His wife, Neelam Sharma, was not in a good mood and was unwilling to attend, so she decided to stay home. Accompanied by her dog C and her enormous parrot, a very talkative bird with exotic plumage. With the family's departure, the atmosphere in the house was one of apparent tranquility. At night, when Vijay and his children returned, upon opening the door, they were met with a scene of indescribable horror. The dog lay dead, a small victim of violence. And further on, Neelam's inert body. She had also been murdered. The house was completely ransacked, everything turned upside down. A clear indication of robbery. The attackers had stolen valuable objects, jewelry, everything they could take. When the police arrived, the scene was Dantean, a silent testimony to the brutality. However, the killers had been careful. There was no clear evidence, nor the murder weapon. Some fingerprints were taken, but the vast majority belonged to the family itself or to people with legitimate reasons to be there. The door did not appear broken, although the house, unlike the one in Monterrey with its bars and gate, was not as secure. The attackers could have entered without great difficulty. The criminal case remained open, plunging the family into deep sorrow. After the funeral rituals, the family continued to occupy the same place, trying to rebuild their lives. But they noticed something unusual. The parakeet, the sole survivor of the massacre, looked visibly sad. That animal, which had always been so boisterous, so cheerful, so almost human in its expression, now barely ate and remained, as if absorbed in its own thoughts. With one paw curled up, hunched over, an image of deep melancholy. However, on the day of the crime, they had found it unharmed in its cage. Vijay Sharma, with an intuition that defied logic, sensed that the animal was in shock from what it had lived through, from what it had heard, from all that trauma. And then, a crazy idea occurred to him. At that moment, the investigation was stalled. No suspect had been found. There were no arrests, only small, scattered clues. It was Vijay Sharma who put an audacious strategy into practice. He had read that, often, domestic crimes are perpetrated by family members or close acquaintances. So, in front of the parakeet, he began to say names. Names of known people. Of relatives. The animal, with its paw clenched, remained motionless, mute, without reaction. And suddenly, in that moment of tense stillness, Vijay Sharma repeated a name. Ashu. The parakeet immediately perked up, as if an invisible spring propelled it. It began to scream in panic. Ashu. 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 It wasn't Ashu, as in sneezing. Ashu was a Hindu name. And it turned out that a relative of the family, a nephew, was named Ashu. The parakeet screamed and screamed, plunged into impressive stress. Immediately, Vijay called the police and told them, "I think it was Ashu. This is happening." The parakeet keeps repeating it. The agents went to interrogate the young man. And, indeed, after 2 or 3 blows, a euphemism denoting an energetic and unorthodox interrogation in the Hindu style, the guy confessed that he was the killer. Although it seems incredible, the parakeet had revealed the culprit's identity. That particular day, Ashu had heard that his family would attend the wedding. He assumed that his uncle, aunt, and cousins would all be absent, leaving the house unoccupied. He decided to break in and steal. However, upon arriving, he found that his aunt, Neelam, had not gone to the wedding. She recognized him. And then he killed her. But the parakeet, the silent witness, had heard. It had heard when the aunt screamed the name of her aggressor, pleading with him, probably, not to kill her. And even so, he killed her. It was, moreover, an act of unheard-of cruelty, as Vijay Sharma had paid for this boy's studies, had helped him on numerous occasions, had had him living in his house for several years, treating him like a son. But Ashu, lately, had become involved in drug issues and dark things. He was desperate, and that desperation led him to commit the crime. Shortly after revealing the killer's identity, the parakeet died. The stress caused by what it lived through killed it. And shortly after, its owner, Vijay Sharma, would not recover from the trauma and would also lose his life. As for the killer, he was sentenced to life imprisonment. Although in India, it is known, there is the possibility of applying capital punishment in certain cases. But, and this is the most important thing, in this case, in the criminal file, in the official documents of the police investigation, it does state that thanks to the parakeet, it was possible to know who the killer was. An official confirmation of an animal testimony. Thus, this has been an unusual program, a journey through crimes and mysteries where the protagonists were not always human, but beings with feathers and a gift for imitation. We have talked about unusual witnesses who have helped solve cases, some of which, due to their extraordinary nature, have not been officially recognized in the file, as in the Aramburi case in Monterrey, Nuevo León. There, the authorities officially said they followed a trail of blood, but many witnesses claimed to have heard the parakeet scream, "Don't kill me, Gabriel, don't kill me," just as the police entered. Other times, as in the India case, the parakeet's testimony was crucial and officially accepted. These cases invite us to reflect on the limits of perception, memory, and the very definition of witness. In the intricate labyrinth of truth, sometimes the most unsuspected voice is the one that utters the last word, revealing the darkest secret.